Welcome to another journey through the shadows of history. Tonight, we venture into the ancient world of Rome, not to the marble columns of the Forum or the grand spectacles of the Colosseum, but to the dimly lit streets where a different kind of human experience unfolded daily. Close your eyes and let yourself drift back nearly 2,000 years, to a time when the Roman Empire stretched across the known world, bringing with it both unprecedented prosperity and profound human suffering. While you're getting comfortable, please subscribe and comment below where you're watching and what time it is there in the narrow alleyways of cities like Rome, Pompeii, and Ephesus, behind unmarked doors and beneath flickering oil lamps, existed. A world that few historical accounts dare to examine closely. The lupanars, as they were called, the brothels of ancient Rome, were as much a part of daily life as the bakeries and taverns. Yet they harbored stories of exploitation, survival, and the darkest corners of human nature than most would rather forget. The word lupanar itself comes from the Latin word for wolf, lupa, a term that carried multiple meanings in Roman society. Wolves were predators, survivors, creatures that lived on the margins of civilization. The she-wolf had suckled Romulus and Remus, the mythical founders of Rome, yet the same word was used to describe the women who worked in these establishments. This linguistic connection reveals something profound about how Roman society viewed both the necessity and the shame of these places. Tonight, we'll explore this hidden world not with sensationalism, but with the quiet understanding that history, in all its forms, deserves to be remembered. We'll walk through the experiences of those who had no choice but to endure, those who profited from their suffering, and those who observed from the safety of their privileged positions. The Rome we'll discover tonight is not the gleaming marble empire of Hollywood films, but a place where human dignity was bought and sold as casually as bread in the marketplace. Imagine yourself transported to a time when the scent of burning, olive oil mixed with unwashed bodies and cheap perfume, when the sounds of the city, cartwheels on stone, merchants calling their wares, the distant roar of crowds at the amphitheater, formed a constant backdrop to private human dramas, playing out in cramped, windowless rooms. This was a world where survival depended not on strength or cunning, but on the ability to disappear into oneself, to become nothing more than a vessel for others' desires while preserving whatever fragment of humanity remained. Settle in. Let your breathing slow, and prepare to witness a world where survival meant enduring the unthinkable, where bodies were currency, and where the line between civilization and barbarity was thinner than the walls that separated the brothels from the respectable world outside. This is the story of why you wouldn't last a day in a Roman brothel, not because of physical discomfort, but because of the complete erosion of human dignity that defined every moment of existence within those walls. Picture yourself awakening, not to the gentle morning light filtering through window shutters, but to the harsh reality of a windowless cell barely larger than a modern closet. The walls around you are rough stone, stained with moisture and decades of human misery. There is no door to your room, only a heavy curtain that provides the illusion of privacy while ensuring that you can never truly be alone. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, cheap incense meant to mask more unpleasant odors, and the lingering scent of the olive oil that serves as both lamp fuel and a crude form of lubricant. Your name, if you remember it, doesn't matter here. You are known only by the name painted on the wall above your workspace, perhaps Venus, or Salacia, or simply the Greek girl. These names change as easily as the paint that bears them. Chosen not by you, but by the lanista, the keeper of this establishment, who sees you as nothing more than inventory to be branded and marketed. Your real name, the one your mother whispered to you in whatever distant land you came from, has become a secret you guard jealously, one of the few possessions that remains truly yours. The day begins before dawn, not with a gentle stirring of natural waking, but with the rough shake of a hand on your shoulder. Sleep, when it comes, is fitful and brief. The sounds of the city never truly fade. The creak of cartwheels on cobblestones, the distant shouts of the night watch, the occasional cry from neighboring cells. But more than external noise, it's the internal chaos that keeps rest at bay. Your body aches from the previous day's work, not just from physical exertion, but from the constant tension of being perpetually on guard, of never knowing whether the next client will be rough or gentle, drunk or sober, young or old. The morning. Ritual begins with what passes for washing in this place. Water is precious and not wasted on the likes of you. A basin of tepid water we use throughout the establishment serves multiple women. You splash your face, rinse your mouth with water that tastes of metal and neglect, and attempt to clean the most necessary parts of your body. There is no privacy. For this, other women move around you in the narrow corridor, each focused on her own preparation, each lost in her own survival strategy. Your clothing, such as it is, consists of the cheapest possible fabric. A rough tunic that barely covers your thighs, dyed in colors that were once bright, but have faded to muddy approximations of their original hues. No undergarments. Such luxuries are not provided, and even if they were, they would only create obstacles to the work ahead. Your feet are bare. Shoes are another unnecessary expense in the eyes of your keeper. The stone floors are cold and often damp, and over time, the soles of your feet have developed thick calluses that serve as natural protection. The lupanar where you work is a maze of narrow corridors and tiny chambers, each designed for maximum efficiency rather than human comfort. The ceilings are low, barely high enough for a tall man to stand upright, and the walls are thin enough that every sound carries throughout the building. There are no windows in the working areas, partly for security, partly because the activities within are meant to remain hidden from the respectable world outside. The only light comes from oil lamps that burn constantly, filling the air with smoke and the acrid smell of burning oil. Your cell, for that is what it truly is, contains only the most basic necessities. A narrow bed with a thin mattress, stuffed with straw, a small table that serves multiple purposes, and a chamber pot that you must empty yourself. The bed is the center of your existence, the place where you spend most of your waking hours, where you eat your meager meals, and where you service the endless stream of men who seek you out. The clientele begins arriving shortly after dawn. These are not the wealthy patricians with their fine togas and educated speech. Those men have access to higher class establishments or maintain their own private slaves. Your clients are the working men of Rome, soldiers on leave, laborers from the docks, shopkeepers, freedmen trying to demonstrate their newfound status, and slaves who have managed to scrape together enough coins for a brief respite from their own misery. Each client pays the same small fee, perhaps 2 or 3 sestertii, less than the cost of a decent meal. This money goes not to you, but to the lanista, who provides you with food, shelter, and protection in exchange for your complete compliance. You see none of the profits from your own body, though you are expected to be grateful for the privilege of having a roof over your head and regular meals. However meager they might be, the work itself is mechanical, repetitive, and soul-crushing in its monotony. Client after client, hour after hour, with barely time to clean yourself between encounters. There is no tenderness here, no romance, no consideration for your comfort or pleasure. You are a receptacle, a means to an end, a temporary solution to a biological urge. Some clients are quick and efficient, finishing their business and leaving without a word. Others linger, sometimes attempting conversation, sometimes becoming rough when they don't receive the response they expect. The physical toll is enormous. Your body is constantly sore, constantly tired, constantly fighting off the various ailments that spread easily in such close quarters. There are no physicians for the likes of you. If you become seriously ill, you become a liability rather than an asset. Minor injuries and ailments must be endured in silence. The constant stream of different men brings with it a variety of diseases, some immediately apparent, others that develop slowly over time. But perhaps more devastating than the physical damage is the psychological toll. Each encounter requires you to disappear into yourself, to become an empty vessel while preserving whatever small spark of humanity remains. You learn to dissociate, to send your mind to other places while your body performs its required functions. Some women develop elaborate fantasy lives, imagining themselves in distant lands or different circumstances. Others simply learn to think of nothing at all, to exist in a state of mental numbness that makes the hours pass more quickly. The other. Women in the lupanar are your only companions. But even these relationships are complicated by the conditions of your existence. There is competition for the clients who pay a little extra, who are gentler, who finish quickly. There is jealousy over small privileges, an extra piece of bread, a newer tunic, a cell slightly larger than the others. Yet there is also a grim camaraderie, a shared understanding of suffering that needs no words. Food is provided twice a day, a thin gruel in the morning, a piece of bread, and perhaps some cheese or olives in the evening. The portions are carefully calculated to keep you alive and functional, but not to provide any pleasure or satisfaction. Water is rationed, and what you receive often tastes of the clay vessels it's stored in, or the questionable sources from which it comes. Wine is occasionally provided, but it's the cheapest possible variety, more vinegar than alcohol, and serves more as a disinfectant than a comfort. The rhythm of the days becomes a blur of sameness. Morning preparation, the arrival of clients. The endless cycle of mechanical encounters, brief moments of rest between customers, the evening meal, and then the restless sleep that brings no real peace. There are no holidays, no days off, no respites from the routine. Even during religious festivals when other businesses might close, the lupanar remains open. If anything, these are busier times, as men seek release from their own celebrations. Lanista, who owns you, is a figure of absolute authority in this small world. He might be a former gladiator, a freedman who has worked his way up in the world, or simply a businessman who sees profit in human misery. His word is law, his approval the difference between slightly better or worse treatment. He enforces discipline through a system of rewards and punishments that would be familiar to anyone who has studied the training of animals. Small favors for compliance, harsh consequences for resistance. Violence is always present, though it takes many forms. There is the threat of physical punishment for disobedience, the constant possibility that a client might become rough or aggressive, and the slow violence of the conditions themselves, the poor food, the lack of medical care, the gradual erosion of health and hope. But perhaps most insidious is the psychological violence, the constant message that you are worthless, that your suffering doesn't matter, that you exist solely for the pleasure of others. As the day progresses, and client after client comes and goes, you begin to understand why someone from the modern world wouldn't last a day in this place. It's not just the physical demands or the lack of modern comforts. It's the complete absence of human dignity, the systematic destruction of self-worth, the relentless message that you are nothing more than a commodity to be used and discarded. The human spirit, no matter how strong, struggles to survive in an environment where every aspect of existence is designed to break it down. The sun sets unseen through the windowless walls, and as darkness falls over the city, the lupanar takes on a different character. The lighting becomes dimmer, the shadows deeper, and the sounds from the street change from the bustle of commerce to the more sinister activities of the night. But for you, there is no real distinction between day and night. The work continues. The clients keep coming, and the cycle of degradation rolls on without pause. As the evening deepens, the character of your workplace shifts subtly but unmistakably. The clientele changes with the darkness. Gone are the hurried, workers grabbing a quick release during their brief break from labor. Now come the soldiers with wine on their breath, the gamblers flush with winnings or desperate from losses, the young men of the plebeian class proving their manhood to companions who wait their turn in the narrow corridor outside. The night brings with it a different kind of energy, more unpredictable, more dangerous. The oil lamps burn lower now, their flames flickering in the stagnant air, casting dancing shadows on the stained walls. The lanista moves through the establishment more frequently during these hours, his presence a constant reminder of the authority structure that governs every aspect of your existence. He carries a heavy wooden staff, ostensibly for protection, but serving more as a symbol of his absolute power over those who work within these walls. His footsteps echo in the narrow corridors, a sound that never fails to quicken your pulse, regardless of how many times you've heard it. During these nighttime hours, you begin to understand the true complexity of the social hierarchy that exists within the lupanar. Not all women here share your fate. Some are freedwomen who have chosen this life, if choice can truly be said to exist for those with no other options. Others are foreign slaves like yourself, captured in distant wars, or sold by desperate families. A few are Roman citizens who have fallen into debt or disgrace, their citizenship offering them no protection in this place, where money is the only law that matters. The conversations you overhear between clients reveal the casual cruelty of Roman society toward those deemed expendable. Men discuss their visits to establishments like this one as casually as they might talk about a visit to the baths or a meal at a tavern. They rate the women they've used, compare experiences, make crude jokes about bodies that have no choice, but to endure whatever is demanded of them. You learn to listen without appearing to hear, to absorb information that might be useful for survival while maintaining the appearance of disinterest. The physical demands of the work intensify during the night hours. Clients are more likely to be intoxicated, less likely to be gentle, more inclined to demand services beyond the basic transaction. Some arrive with specific fantasies they expect you to fulfill, elaborate scenarios that require you to play roles. The innocent virgin, the experienced courtesan, the foreign exotic. These performances are exhausting not just physically, but emotionally, requiring you to access parts of yourself you'd rather keep hidden, while maintaining the illusion that you enjoy what is being done to you. The sounds of the night create a constant soundtrack to your work. From the street comes the clatter of hobnailed boots on stone as patrols make their rounds, the distant laughter from taverns, the occasional shout of conflict or celebration. From within the building comes a symphony of human activity. The creak of beds, muffled voices, the occasional cry that might be pleasure or pain, the constant shuffle of feet in the corridors. You learn to read these sounds, to understand what they mean about the mood of the establishment, the satisfaction of clients, the safety of your fellow workers. The other women become your closest allies during these dark hours. There is an unspoken understanding between you, a shared knowledge of suffering that needs no words. You develop signals, a particular look that means a client is dangerous, a gesture that indicates someone needs help, a way of positioning yourself that offers protection to a younger or more vulnerable woman. These small acts of solidarity are among the few sources of humanity left in this place, flickering points of light in an otherwise endless darkness. Water becomes even more precious during the night hours. The constant stream of clients, the heat generated by oil lamps and packed bodies, the anxiety that manifests as physical symptoms, all of these create a desperate thirst that is rarely satisfied. The water that is provided tastes increasingly stale as the night progresses, and you learn to sip it slowly to make each small portion last as long as possible. The lack of adequate hydration compounds the physical exhaustion, making each subsequent encounter more difficult to endure. The Lannister's system of control becomes most apparent during these hours. He knows that desperation peaks at night, that the darkness brings with it thoughts of escape, of resistance, of anything that might offer relief from the endless cycle of abuse. His response is to increase his presence, to make random appearances in the corridors, to ensure that his authority is felt at all times. He has developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when someone is reaching their breaking point, and his interventions are swift and decisive. The economics of the night shift reveal the true nature of your situation. During peak hours, the Lannister raises prices slightly, though none of this additional revenue reaches you. Some clients pay extra for specific services or for additional time, but these payments too go directly to your keeper. You begin to understand that you are not just a worker, but a form of property, generating income for others while receiving only the bare minimum necessary to keep you functional. As the night wears on, exhaustion begins to take its toll in ways that go beyond simple tiredness. Your body moves through the motions of service mechanically, but your mind begins to drift, seeking escape in memories of a time before this place, in fantasies of a different life, in the simple act of imagining yourself somewhere else. This mental dissociation is both a survival mechanism and a dangerous luxury. It makes the physical reality bearable, but also leaves you vulnerable to clients who might take advantage of your distraction. The food provided during night hours is even more meager than the day's rations. A piece of stale bread, perhaps a few olives, water that tastes increasingly of the clay vessels in which it's stored. The Lannister knows that hunger is another tool of control, keeping you weak enough to be manageable but strong enough to perform your duties. The constant gnawing sensation in your stomach becomes just another part of the background discomfort that defines your existence. The other businesses in the district begin to close as the night deepens, their proprietors and workers heading home to families and beds, and the simple pleasure of choosing when to sleep. But the Lupaner remains active, its doors open to anyone with coin enough to pay for entry. The contrast between your endless night and the rest of the world's natural rhythm of work and rest becomes a source of particular anguish. while others sleep peacefully. You continue to serve, to endure, to survive hour after hour without respite. The darkness outside the building becomes complete, broken only by the occasional torch carried by a late-night traveler, or the flickering lights from taverns that cater to the night crowd. Inside, the oil lamps burn steadily, their smoke creating a haze that stings your eyes and makes breathing difficult. The air becomes thick with the accumulated heat of human bodies, the smoke from the lamps, and the various odors that no amount of cheap incense can mask. During these deepest hours of night, you sometimes encounter clients who seek something beyond the physical transaction. These men, often drunk or lonely or both, attempt to engage you in conversation, to create the illusion of connection or intimacy. They might ask about your origins, your family, your dreams for the future. These conversations are perhaps the most difficult part of your work, not because they are physically demanding, but because they require you to access parts of yourself that you've learned to keep hidden, to pretend that your responses are genuine rather than calculated for survival. The psychological toll of these interactions is enormous. Each conversation requires you to perform, not just with your body, but with your mind and emotions, to create the illusion of caring while maintaining the emotional distance necessary for survival. Some clients become regular visitors, developing the fantasy that they have a special relationship with you, that you look forward to their visits, that you exist primarily for their pleasure. These delusions can be dangerous when they prevent clients from accepting the purely transactional nature of your interaction. The building itself seems to change character during these hours. The narrow corridors feel even more claustrophobic, the low ceilings more oppressive, the thin walls more intrusive. Every sound seems amplified, the creak of a bed, the whispered conversation between client and worker, the soft padding of bare feet on stone floors. The darkness beyond the reach of the oil lamps feels alive with potential dangers, and you find yourself constantly alert to sounds that might indicate trouble. As dawn approaches, but remains hours away, the night reaches its most challenging phase. Your body is exhausted beyond measure, your mind numbed by the constant stream of encounters, your spirit worn thin by the relentless degradation. Yet the work continues, must continue, will continue until the Lanista decides that enough profit has been extracted from the night's activities. There is no clock to mark the passage of time, no window to show the position of the stars. Only the endless cycle of client after client, each one a small death of dignity, each one a reminder that you have become something less than human. In the eyes of those who use you, the other women around you show the same signs of exhaustion, the same mechanical responses to client demands, the same hollow look in their eyes that speaks of souls that have learned to hide themselves away for protection. Yet there is also a grim determination in their movements, a stubborn refusal to be completely broken by circumstances beyond their control. This shared endurance becomes a form of resistance, a way of maintaining some small spark of humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization. The night seems endless, stretching ahead, like a dark road with no visible destination. Each hour brings new challenges, new clients, new opportunities for degradation or small acts of survival. The knowledge that tomorrow will bring another night exactly like this one, and that the night after that will be the same, and the night after that creates a form of despair that goes beyond simple sadness. It is the complete absence of hope, the understanding that this existence has no foreseeable end. The first hints of dawn do not come as relief, but as a cruel reminder of time's passage. Through the narrow gaps where the building meets the street, you might catch the faintest suggestion of gray light, replacing the absolute darkness of night. But this subtle change in the world outside means little within the windowless confines of the lupanar. Here, time is measured not by the sun's position, but by the ebb and flow of human traffic, the rhythm of commerce and flesh that knows no natural boundaries. The clientele begins to shift again as the city stirs to life. The last of the night's drinkers stumble through the doors, their coin purses lighter, their movements unsteady, their demands often confused and difficult to fulfill. These men present their own particular challenges, their intoxication making them unpredictable, sometimes violent, sometimes melancholic, always requiring careful management to avoid incidents that might bring unwanted attention to the establishment. Your body has reached a state of exhaustion that goes beyond mere tiredness. Every muscle aches with a deep, persistent pain that no amount of rest could fully relieve. Your skin feels raw and sensitive, abraded by the constant contact with rough fabrics, unwashed bodies, and the harsh soap used for the minimal cleaning allowed between clients. The soles of your feet, which have walked these stone floors for countless hours, have developed a numbness that makes each step uncertain, each movement a conscious effort rather than a natural response, a psychological state you've developed. To survive these hours is perhaps even more concerning than the physical damage. You've learned to exist in a state of perpetual dissociation, your mind floating somewhere above and apart from your body, observing the proceedings with a detached interest that would be impossible to maintain if you allowed yourself to fully experience what is happening. This mental splitting is both a blessing and a curse. It allows you to endure the unendurable, but also creates a sense of unreality. That makes it difficult to maintain connection with your own humanity. The other women in the establishment show similar signs of this psychological fragmentation. Conversations, when they occur, tend to focus on practical matters, which clients to avoid, how to manage particular requests, strategies for minimizing pain or discomfort. Personal histories, dreams, or hopes for the future are topics that are rarely discussed, as if speaking of such things might shatter the fragile mental constructs that make survival possible. The Lannista's presence becomes more frequent as dawn approaches, his attention focused on maximizing the revenue from the final hours of peak business. He moves through the corridors with the practiced efficiency of someone who has perfected the art of human exploitation, checking on his property, ensuring that no opportunity for profit is missed. His interactions with the women are purely transactional. He sees bodies, not people, assets to be managed rather than human beings with intrinsic worth. The building itself begins to show the effects of the night's activities. The air has become thick and stale, laden with the accumulated breath of dozens of people, the smoke from oil lamps that have burned throughout the night, and the various odors that no amount of cheap incense can entirely mask. The stone floors are slick with spilled wine, various bodily fluids, and the constant traffic of bare feet and hobnailed boots. The walls, already stained and worn, seem to absorb the misery of the place, becoming repositories of human suffering that speak silently of the thousands of similar nights that have preceded this one. The sounds of the awakening city begin to penetrate the walls, the call of early rising merchants, the rattle of carts being prepared for the day's deliveries, the distant lowing of animals being driven to market. These sounds create a painful contrast with the artificial world of the lupaner, reminding you that life continues normally for most people, that somewhere beyond these walls, others are beginning their days with hope, purpose, and the simple freedom to choose their own actions. The food provided during these early morning hours is even more meager than usual. The Lanista knows that dawn brings with it the possibility of rest, however brief, and he uses the promise of slightly better treatment as a tool of control. A piece of bread that is only slightly stale, water that has been drawn more recently from the well, perhaps even a small portion of cheese or a few olives. These tiny improvements in basic sustenance become precious rewards for those who have survived another night of service. The economic reality of your situation becomes starkly apparent in these dawn hours. As you calculate the number of clients you've served, the amount of money that has changed hands, the profit that has been generated from your body's labor, you begin to understand the true scale of your exploitation. Dozens of transactions, each one generating income for the Lanista, each one wearing away a little more of your physical and mental health, each one contributing to a system that views human beings as renewable resources to be consumed and discarded. The hierarchy among the women becomes more apparent during these quiet hours. Those who have been in the establishment longer have developed strategies for survival that the newer arrivals have not yet learned. They know which clients to fear, which requests to refuse regardless of the consequences, how to position themselves to avoid the Lannista's attention when he is in a particularly foul mood. This knowledge is shared quietly, in whispered conversations during brief moments of rest, creating a network of mutual support that exists entirely outside the official structure of the place, that the physical environment of the lupaner reaches its most oppressive state during these hours. The oil lamps, having burned throughout the night, have filled the air with smoke that makes breathing difficult and stings your eyes. The accumulated heat from dozens of bodies, the lack of ventilation, and the constant activity have created an atmosphere that feels thick and suffocating. The narrow corridors, already claustrophobic, seem to close in further, making movement feel restricted and escape seem impossible. The psychological impact of witnessing the suffering of others adds another layer to your own trauma. You've seen women break down completely, their minds finally unable to cope with the constant degradation. You've watched as some simply stopped responding to anything around them, their eyes becoming vacant, their movements purely mechanical. Others have developed elaborate fantasy lives, talking to themselves in voices that suggest they believe they are somewhere else entirely, with someone who cares about them, living a life that has meaning and dignity. The morning brings with it a shift in the type of clients who visit the establishment. These are often working men beginning their day, seeking a quick transaction before heading to their jobs at the docks, in the workshops, or in the various commercial enterprises that make up the economic life of the city. These clients are usually more focused and businesslike, less likely to linger or make demands beyond the basic service, but also less likely to show any consideration for your comfort or well-being. The routine of cleaning between clients becomes more difficult as exhaustion sets in. The small basin of water that serves multiple women has become increasingly murky throughout the night, and the rough cloth used for washing has lost whatever cleansing properties it might have once possessed. The process of attempting to maintain basic hygiene under these conditions becomes a futile gesture, a reminder of the impossibility of maintaining dignity in circumstances designed to strip it away. The knowledge that this night will end, that there will be a few hours of rest before the cycle begins again, provides no real comfort. The rest that awaits is not the peaceful sleep of someone who has completed satisfying work, but the unconsciousness of someone whose body and mind have been pushed beyond their limits. Sleep, when it comes, will be fitful and interrupted, filled with dreams that might be memories or fears, and will end all too soon with the beginning of another identical day. The other women in the establishment begin to show signs of the particular exhaustion that comes with this work. Their movements become slower, more deliberate, as if each action requires conscious thought rather than natural response. Their voices, when they speak at all, become flat and monotonous, drained of the inflection that indicates emotional engagement. Their eyes develop a particular quality, not exactly vacant, but distant, as if they are looking at something beyond the immediate environment, something that exists only in their memories, or imagination. The Lannista's behavior during these hours reveals the calculated nature of his cruelty. He knows that dawn brings with it the deepest level of exhaustion, the point at which resistance becomes nearly impossible. This is when he chooses to make his most unreasonable demands, to impose additional punishments, to remind everyone of their complete dependence on his goodwill. His timing is not accidental. It is the result of years of experience in breaking human spirits, of understanding exactly when people are most vulnerable to further degradation. The building's architecture seems designed to amplify the sense of despair that accompanies these hours. The narrow corridors create a sense of confinement that goes beyond mere physical restriction. They suggest that there is no escape, no alternative path, no possibility of finding a way out of this maze of human misery. The low ceilings create a feeling of oppression that makes breathing feel difficult, while the windowless walls eliminate any connection to the natural world outside. The sounds from the street begin to change as the city fully awakens. The early morning merchants give way to the fuller bustle of commercial activity, the sound of children's voices as they head to schools or apprenticeships, the calls of vendors offering fresh bread, fruit, and other goods to those who have the freedom and resources to purchase them. These sounds create a cruel counterpoint to the artificial world of the lupaner, reminding you that normal life continues, just beyond the walls that confine you. The air in the building becomes increasingly stale as the night progresses toward dawn. The oil lamps, having burned for hours, have consumed much of the available oxygen, while a constant presence of multiple people in confined spaces has added breath, sweat, and other bodily emissions to the atmosphere. The lack of windows means there is no natural ventilation, no way for fresh air to enter or stale air to escape. Breathing becomes a conscious effort, and the stuffiness adds to the general sense of oppression that defines the environment. Water situation becomes critical during these hours. The small amounts provided for drinking and washing have been consumed or contaminated, yet the physical demands of the work continue to create thirst and the need for basic hygiene. The lanista knows that controlling access to water is another tool of power, another way to maintain absolute authority over those who work for him. The promise of clean water becomes a reward to be earned through compliance, a privilege that can be withdrawn at will. The final hours before dawn bring with them a particular type of client, men who have spent the night drinking, gambling, or engaging in other activities, and who arrive at the lupaner as a final stop before heading home. These clients are often in the worst condition, their judgment impaired by alcohol or exhaustion, their behavior unpredictable and sometimes dangerous. They present the greatest challenges of the night, requiring the most careful management to avoid incidents that might bring unwanted attention to the establishment. As the first real light of dawn begins to filter through the gaps in the building structure, you realize that you have survived another night. This realization brings no joy, no sense of accomplishment, no feeling of victory. Instead, it brings only the knowledge that you will soon be allowed a few hours of rest before the cycle begins again. The approaching dawn is not a symbol of hope or renewal, but simply another marker in the endless repetition of days that have no meaning beyond survival, no purpose beyond generating profit for others, no end beyond the eventual breakdown of your body or spirit. But not all who sold their bodies in ancient Rome lived in the squalid conditions of the common lupaners. To understand the full spectrum of sexual commerce in the empire, we must turn our attention to a different world entirely, one of silk, curtains, perfumed oils, and the illusion of choice. Let us follow the story of a woman named Phoebe, whose life illuminates the complex hierarchies that existed within the trade in human intimacy, and whose fate reveals that even the highest levels of this profession offered only a more beautiful form of bondage. Phoebe was born in Alexandria, the great city of learning and commerce at the mouth of the Nile. Her father was a merchant of moderate success, trading in papyrus and exotic spices from the interior of Africa. Her mother was Greek, descended from one of the many families who had settled in Egypt following Alexander's conquests centuries earlier. They named their daughter after the goddess associated with the moon and prophecy, perhaps hoping that she would possess the wisdom to navigate the complex world into which she had been born. The Alexandria of Vandria of Athens. Phoebe's childhood was a city of remarkable diversity and cultural sophistication. The great library still stood, though diminished from its former glory, and the Mouseion continued to attract scholars from across the Mediterranean world. The city's harbor bustled with ships from every corner of the empire, bringing not only goods, but ideas, languages, and peoples from distant lands. It was a place where a clever child could receive an education that would have been impossible in most other cities of the ancient world. Phoebe's early years were comfortable, if not luxurious. Her father's business provided the family with a house near the harbor district, servants to manage the household duties, and enough wealth to ensure that she received the education typically reserved for boys. She learned to read and write in both Greek and Latin, studied the works of the classical poets and philosophers, and developed the skills in music and rhetoric that marked a person of refinement. Her beauty was apparent from an early age, the kind of striking appearance that combined the best features of her Greek and Egyptian heritage. But the prosperity that had sheltered Phoebe's childhood was built on foundations more fragile than her family realized. Her father's business depended heavily on trading relationships that extended across the eastern Mediterranean, connections that could be disrupted by political changes, natural disasters, or simple shifts in commercial patterns. When she was 15, a series of disasters struck in rapid succession. Storms destroyed several of his ships, a warehouse fire consumed a season's worth of inventory, and political unrest in one of his key trading regions made further commerce impossible. The family's decline was swift and merciless. Within a matter of months, they lost their house, their servants, and most of their possessions. Phoebe's father, faced with debts he could never hope to repay, made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his short remaining life. Rather than see his daughter sold into common slavery to satisfy his creditors, he arranged for her to be purchased by a woman named Claudia Maxima, who operated what was euphemistically called a school for young ladies in the fashionable district of Rome. The journey from Alexandria to Rome was Phoebe's first real glimpse of the world beyond her sheltered childhood. Traveling by ship across the Mediterranean, she found herself in the company of other young women who had been purchased for similar purposes. Some were the daughters of families who had fallen into debt. Others were captives from various military campaigns. And a few were volunteers who had made the calculation that this life offered better prospects than the alternatives available. To them, Claudia Maxima's establishment was located in a villa on the Aventine Hill, far removed from the squalid lupanars of the Subura, but still carefully positioned to be accessible to wealthy clients without drawing unwanted attention from the respectable neighborhoods. The building itself was a testament to the profits that could be extracted from the trade in refined sexuality. Marble floors imported from distant quarries, frescoes painted by accomplished artists, gardens that rivaled those of senators, homes, and furnishings that spoke of wealth accumulated over years of careful business management. The training that Phoebe received in Claudia's establishment was comprehensive and sophisticated. She learned to play musical instruments with professional skill, to recite poetry in multiple languages, to engage in the kind of witty conversation that Romans prized at their dinner parties. She studied the art of cosmetics and personal presentation, learning to enhance her natural beauty with techniques that had been passed down through generations of women who had made their living through their appearance. But alongside these cultural refinements, Phoebe also received instruction in the more intimate aspects of her future profession. This education was conducted with a clinical detachment that somehow made it more disturbing than if it had been openly crude. She learned to read the desires and fantasies of men, to fulfill requests that ranged from the conventional to the exotic, to maintain the illusion of enthusiasm and participation, regardless of her own feelings about what was being asked of her. The psychological preparation was perhaps the most crucial part of her training. Claudia understood that women at this level of the profession needed to maintain their sanity and attractiveness over periods of years rather than months. The techniques she taught were designed to help her charges create mental compartments, to separate their professional selves from their private identities, to develop the kind of emotional armor that would allow them to survive intimate contact with dozens of different men while preserving some core sense of self. Phoebe's debut into the profession was carefully orchestrated to maximize both her value and Claudia's profit. A series of private dinners were arranged where potential clients could meet her in a social setting, ostensibly as a guest rather than as someone available for purchase. These events allowed wealthy Romans to assess her education, her beauty, and her personality before committing to the substantial fees that Claudia commanded for her services. The men who attended these gatherings represented the upper echelons of Roman society. There were senators whose votes shaped imperial policy, wealthy merchants whose businesses spanned continents, military commanders who controlled the fates of entire provinces, and members of the imperial court whose proximity to power made them valuable allies or dangerous enemies. They were educated, sophisticated, and accustomed to getting whatever they desired, regardless of the cost to others. Phoebe's first client was a senator named Gaius Lucilius Maximus, a man in his 50s who had built his political career on a combination of inherited wealth, strategic marriages, and carefully cultivated relationships with more powerful patrons. He was known for his cultured tastes, his extensive private library, and his patronage of poets and artists. To the outside world, he appeared to be exactly the kind of refined gentleman that the Roman elite aspired to become. The evening she spent with Lucilius was conducted with all the trappings of civilized society. They dined on delicacies imported from across the empire, discussed philosophy and literature, and listened to musicians who had been trained in the finest conservatories of the Greek cities. Only afterward, in the privacy of his luxuriously appointed bedroom, did the true nature of their relationship become apparent. What followed was not the brutal assault that might occur in a common lupanar, but something more subtle and in many ways more disturbing, the careful, methodical consumption of her dignity by someone who understood exactly what he was taking from her. The psychological impact of this encounter was profound. Phoebe had been prepared for physical demands, but she had not anticipated the way that educated, cultured men could strip away her humanity while maintaining the pretense of respect and affection. Lucilius spoke to her as if she were a real person, asked about her thoughts and feelings, even seemed to care about her comfort and pleasure. But underlying all of these apparent kindnesses was the fundamental reality that she was property, purchased for his use, with no real choice in what happened to her body or her life. Over the following months, Phoebe was introduced to a succession of clients each representing a different aspect of Roman power and privilege. There was Marcus Flavius Antonius, a wealthy merchant who had made his fortune importing silk from the distant lands beyond the empire's eastern borders. His tastes ran toward elaborate scenarios in which Phoebe was required to play the role of an exotic princess or a captured barbarian queen, fantasies that revealed as much about Roman attitudes toward foreign peoples as they did about his personal desires. Another regular client was Titus Valerius Corvus, a military commander who had recently returned from campaigns in Germania. His experiences on the frontier had left him with psychological scars that manifested in his intimate life as a need for complete control and submission. The hours Phoebe spent with him were exercises in dominance and humiliation that pushed the boundaries of what even her training had prepared her for, yet which were conducted with the same ritualistic precision that characterized all aspects of Roman military life. Perhaps the most disturbing of her regular clients was Quintus Ceruleus Scipio, a man who held a position in the imperial bureaucracy that gave him access to vast amounts of sensitive information about the governance of the empire. His particular obsession was with corruption and betrayal, themes that played out in elaborate scenarios where Phoebe was required to portray various roles: the unfaithful wife, the treacherous slave, the corrupt official, while he acted out fantasies of discovery and punishment that clearly drew from his professional experiences. The financial arrangements surrounding Phoebe's work were complex and designed to maintain the illusion that she was something more than a common prostitute. Rather than direct payment for services, clients made donations to Claudia's establishment, contributions that were carefully recorded and managed to avoid the legal complications that might arise from more straightforward commercial transactions. Phoebe herself never handled money directly, maintaining the fiction that she was a guest in Claudia's house rather than an employee or slave. The economic reality was clear to anyone who cared to examine it closely. A single evening with Phoebe might cost a client the equivalent of what a skilled craftsman could earn in a year. These enormous fees reflected not just her beauty and training, but also the exclusivity that Claudia carefully maintained. By limiting access and charging premium prices, she had created an artificial scarcity that increased demand while maximizing profits. The social dimension of Phoebe's work was perhaps even more complex than the financial arrangements. Many of her clients were married men whose wives were expected to be models of virtue and restraint, women who had been raised to view sexuality as a duty rather than a pleasure. These men came to Phoebe seeking not just physical satisfaction, but emotional and intellectual engagement that was absent from their conventional relationships. They wanted to talk to a beautiful, educated woman who would listen to their thoughts and respond with intelligence and wit, who would make them feel not just physically satisfied, but intellectually stimulated. This created a psychological dynamic that was deeply damaging to Phoebe's sense of self. She was required to provide not just her body, but her mind and emotions, to create genuine seeming connections with men who were fundamentally using her, to offer understanding and compassion to people who viewed her as an object to be consumed. The line between performance and reality became increasingly blurred as she spent more time with these clients, many of whom genuinely believed that she enjoyed their company and looked forward to their visits. The physical demands of her work, while less brutal than those faced by women in common brothels, were nevertheless substantial. The need to maintain her appearance at the highest possible level required constant attention to diet, exercise, and grooming. She spent hours each day in various forms of beauty treatments, using expensive cosmetics and perfumes, arranging her hair in increasingly elaborate styles, and maintaining the kind of physical perfection that her clients expected and demanded. The isolation that characterized Phoebe's life became one of its most difficult aspects. While she lived in luxury and was treated with apparent respect, she had no real friends, no genuine relationships, no connections to the normal social life of the city. The other women in Claudia's establishment were potential competitors rather than allies, and her clients, despite their apparent affection, saw her as property rather than as a person. She existed in a kind of social limbo, neither slave nor free, neither respectable nor completely outcast. The psychological toll of this isolation was compounded by the constant need to perform, to be always beautiful, always charming, always available for whatever her clients might demand. There was no time or space for authentic emotion, no opportunity to express genuine thoughts or feelings, no possibility of forming real human connections. She became, in effect, a living work of art, beautiful and valuable, but fundamentally lifeless, existing solely for the pleasure and satisfaction of others. As months turned to years, Phoebe's reputation within the exclusive circles of Roman society grew steadily. Her name was whispered in the private dining rooms of senators, mentioned in discreet conversations between wealthy merchants, and included in the coded discussions that took place in the shadowy world where politics and pleasure intersected. She had become what Claudia had intended, a perfect commodity disguised as a cultured companion, a woman whose value lay not just in her physical beauty, but in her ability to provide the illusion of genuine intimacy to men who could afford to purchase whatever they desired. The routine of her days followed a pattern as rigid as any military discipline, though disguised beneath layers of luxury and apparent choice. Each morning began with extensive preparations, baths in water scented with oils imported from distant provinces, careful application of cosmetics that enhanced her natural beauty without appearing artificial, the selection of clothing and jewelry appropriate to the day's appointments. These preparations were not merely matters of vanity, but essential tools of her trade, each element carefully chosen to create the desired effect on the men, who would pay enormous sums for her company. Her education continued even as she worked, for Claudia understood that maintaining Phoebe's value required constant refinement of her skills. Private tutors instructed her in the latest developments in philosophy and literature. Musicians taught her new songs and instrumental techniques, and specialists in rhetoric helped her perfect the art of conversation that was so crucial to her success. She became, in effect, a scholar of human desire, studying the weaknesses and fantasies of powerful men with the same dedication that others might apply to mathematics or natural philosophy. The clients who sought her services represented not just wealth, but power in its most concentrated forms. There was Lucius Cornelius Balbus, whose family had provided advisors to 3 different emperors, and whose intimate knowledge of imperial politics made him one of the most influential men in Rome. His visits to Phoebe were exercises in careful theater, elaborate scenarios where she played the role of various historical figures while he acted out fantasies of conquest and domination that clearly reflected his own relationship with power. Another regular visitor was Gaius Asinius Gallus, a man whose wealth came from extensive land holdings across the empire, and whose political influence stemmed from his ability to provide grain to the masses of Rome during times of shortage. His particular obsession was with the exotic and foreign, requiring Phoebe to master the customs and languages of distant peoples, so that she could convincingly portray barbarian princesses, Eastern temple dancers, or captured Germanic warriors. These elaborate performances required not just physical beauty, but genuine acting ability and cultural knowledge that would have impressed professional entertainers. Perhaps the most disturbing of her regular clients was Marcus Aemilius Scaurus, a man whose position in the imperial court gave him direct access to the emperor, and whose recommendations could determine the fates of entire provinces. His tastes ran toward elaborate psychological games in which Phoebe was required to play multiple roles within complex scenarios that often lasted for hours. She might begin an evening as a senator's daughter, become a slave girl through some imagined transgression, and end as a foreign queen seeking mercy from a conquering general. These performances demanded not just physical endurance, but extraordinary mental agility and emotional control. The financial arrangements surrounding these encounters became increasingly complex as Phoebe's reputation grew. Rather than simple payment for services, clients often provided gifts that technically maintained the fiction that she was a respected companion rather than a purchased commodity. These gifts might include jewelry worth more than most Romans would see in a lifetime, rare books copied by the finest scribes, or even small properties that generated ongoing income. The legal fiction was maintained through elaborate contracts that described her as a cultural advisor or social companion, documents that fooled no one but provided the necessary cover for men who needed to maintain their public reputations. Yet, beneath the veneer of luxury and respect, the fundamental reality of Phoebe's situation remained unchanged. She was property owned by Claudia and rented to clients who possessed the wealth and power to purchase whatever they desired. Her beautiful clothes, her elegant surroundings, and her apparent freedom of movement were all carefully controlled. illusions designed to increase her value while ensuring her compliance. The golden chains that bound her were no less real for being invisible, and the cage that confined her was no less restrictive for being gilded with silk and decorated with precious stones. The psychological damage inflicted by this life manifested in subtle but profound ways. Phoebe found herself losing the ability to experience genuine emotions, her responses becoming as carefully calculated and artificial as her appearance. Laughter became a professional tool rather than an expression of joy, tears a strategic weapon rather than a sign of sorrow, and affection a performance rather than a feeling. She existed in a state of constant emotional dissociation, her true self buried so deeply beneath layers of professional persona that she sometimes wondered if it still existed at all. The other women in Claudia's establishment provided no real companionship, for they were all potential competitors in a market where youth and beauty were finite resources. Friendships were impossible when each woman's success might come at the expense of another's livelihood, and genuine intimacy was out of the question when everyone was constantly performing for an audience of one kind or another. The isolation was absolute, made worse by the constant presence of other people who could never be trusted with authentic thoughts or feelings. The seasonal rhythms of Roman social life created their own patterns of demand for Phoebe's services. During the winter months, when the wealthy retreated to their urban villas and focused on political maneuvering, she might spend her evenings at intimate dinner parties, where she provided intellectual stimulation and cultural entertainment alongside more private services. The summer months brought different opportunities, as clients retreated to country estates and seaside villas, where longer engagements were possible and the pretense of romantic attachment could be more fully developed. One of her most significant relationships developed with a senator named Quintus Hortensius Hortulus, a man whose political career had been built on his reputation for integrity and moral virtue. His public persona was that of a traditional Ramang, devoted to family values and civic duty, qualities that had made him popular with voters and valuable to political allies. Yet his private desires revealed a man consumed by fantasies of domination and control that would have destroyed his public reputation if they became known. The arrangement with Hortensius extended beyond simple commercial transactions to something resembling a genuine relationship, though one built on foundations of deception and exploitation. He visited Phoebe regularly for more than 2 years, often spending entire nights in her company, engaging in long conversations about politics, philosophy, and literature before turning to more intimate activities. He spoke to her about his fears and ambitions, his family problems and political concerns, creating the illusion of emotional intimacy that made their relationship feel more authentic than the purely transactional encounters she had with other clients. Yet this apparent intimacy was itself a form of exploitation, requiring Phoebe to provide not just her body, but her mind and emotions as well. Hortensius genuinely believed that she cared about him, that she looked forward to his visits, that she was in some sense his partner rather than his property. This delusion allowed him to feel better about what he was doing, while placing an enormous emotional burden on Phoebe, who had to maintain the performance of affection, even as she understood the fundamental inequality of their relationship. The political dimension of Phoebe's work became more apparent as her client base expanded to include men whose decisions affected the governance of the empire. Through her interactions with senators, imperial administrators, and military commanders, she gained access to information that would have been valuable to foreign enemies or domestic rivals. She learned about upcoming policy changes, military deployments, and political alliances before they became public knowledge, information that Claudia carefully cataloged and occasionally used for her own purposes. This access to sensitive information created its own form of vulnerability, for Phoebe became a potential security risk in the eyes of those who employed her services. Several of her clients made it clear that her continued health and safety depended on her absolute discretion, threats that were delivered with the casual ease of men accustomed to having their wishes treated as commands. She learned to listen, without appearing to hear, to absorb information without seeming to understand its significance, to become a repository of secrets that she could never share without risking everything. The physical demands of maintaining her position required constant vigilance and self-discipline. Her diet was carefully controlled to preserve her figure, her exercise regimen designed to maintain flexibility and stamina, and her sleep schedule adjusted to accommodate the irregular hours demanded by her profession. She submitted to regular examinations by physicians who checked for signs of disease or pregnancy, conditions that would render her temporarily or permanently unavailable for work. These medical examinations were conducted with clinical detachment, treating her body as a valuable asset to be maintained rather than as a person deserving of dignity or privacy. The cosmetic requirements of her work became increasingly elaborate as she aged and faced competition from younger women entering Claudia's stable. What had once been simple enhancement of natural beauty became a complex daily ritual involving exotic treatments, expensive preparations, and techniques that bordered on the surgical. Every line, every blemish, every sign of aging became a potential threat to her livelihood, requiring constant attention and increasingly desperate measures to conceal. The seasonal celebrations and religious festivals that marked the Roman calendar created their own patterns of demand and opportunity. During the Saturnalia, when normal social rules were temporarily suspended, clients felt freer to indulge in fantasies that might seem too extreme during ordinary times. The celebration of various gods and goddesses provided themes for elaborate role-playing scenarios, while political festivals created opportunities for networking and information gathering that extended well beyond simple commercial transactions. Phoebe's relationship with Claudia evolved over time from simple owner and property to something more complex and mutually dependent. As her reputation grew and her client base expanded, she became increasingly valuable to the establishment, generating profits that funded Claudia's expansion into other ventures and provided the foundation for a small commercial empire. Yet this increased value brought with it not freedom, but greater restrictions, for Claudia could not afford to lose such a profitable asset to accident, illness, or defection. The legal status of women like Phoebe existed in a gray area of Roman law that reflected the empire's ambivalent attitude toward sexuality and commerce. Technically, they were not slaves in the traditional sense, for they had been purchased rather than captured or born into bondage. Yet they possessed none of the rights of free citizens, could not own property in their own names, and had no legal recourse if they were mistreated by clients or employers. They existed in a legal limbo that made them vulnerable to exploitation while providing no protection from abuse. The knowledge that she was aging in a profession that prized youth above all other qualities created a constant undercurrent of anxiety in Phoebe's daily life. She watched as older women in the establishment were gradually relegated to less prestigious clients, given fewer opportunities, and eventually discarded entirely when they could no longer maintain the standards required for elite clientele. The future that awaited her was clearly visible in the fate of those who had preceded her, yet she had no power to change course or secure her own survival beyond the period of her physical prime. The contrast between her public persona and private reality became one of the most psychologically damaging aspects of Phoebe's existence. To the outside world, she appeared to be a sophisticated, independent woman who moved freely through the highest levels of Roman society. Yet every aspect of her life was controlled by others, every decision filtered through calculations of profit and loss, every relationship distorted by the fundamental inequality between purchaser and commodity. She lived constantly with the knowledge that her apparent freedom was an illusion, her supposed independence a carefully maintained fiction designed to increase her market value. The beginning of the end for Phoebe came not through any dramatic event or sudden revelation, but through the slow accumulation of small changes that marked the passage of time in a profession where youth was the primary currency. She was approaching her 28th year when she first noticed the subtle shifts in her clients' behavior, conversations that lasted a little longer before turning to physical intimacy, requests for scenarios that relied more heavily on her intellectual abilities than her physical appeal, and most tellingly, the gradual decrease in the frequency of new clients seeking her services. Claudia, ever the astute businesswoman, was among the first to recognize these changes. Their conversations began to include veiled references to the future, discussions of how Phoebe might transition to different roles within the establishment, suggestions that she begin training younger women in the arts she had mastered. These conversations were conducted with the same careful diplomacy that characterized all interactions in their world. But the underlying message was unmistakable. Phoebe's time as a premier attraction was drawing to a close. The realization that her career was entering its final phase brought with it a complex mixture of emotions that Phoebe struggled to process. On one hand, there was a sense of relief at the prospect of no longer having to perform intimate services for an endless stream of clients. The thought of being able to sleep through an entire night without interruption, of eating meals without calculating their effect on her figure, of existing for even brief periods without having to maintain perfect composure, seemed almost impossibly luxurious. Yet alongside this relief came a terror that was far more profound. For nearly a decade, her entire identity had been constructed around her value as a commodity, her worth measured by her ability to satisfy the desires of wealthy men. Without that role, what would she become? Where would she go? What skills did she possess that would allow her to survive in a world that had no place for aging courtesans who knew too many dangerous secrets? The transition was managed with characteristic care by Claudia, who understood that the way Phoebe's career ended would affect the perception of the establishment and the value of its remaining assets. Rather than an abrupt termination of her services, there was a gradual shifting of her responsibilities toward more administrative and training roles. She began spending her time teaching newer acquisitions the skills they would need to succeed, passing on the techniques of conversation, performance, and emotional manipulation that had served her so well. This new role as a trainer and mentor brought its own forms of psychological torture. Watching young women arrive at the establishment, some barely past childhood, others the daughters of respectable families who had fallen into misfortune, forced Phoebe to confront the reality of what had been done to her and what she was now helping to perpetuate. The knowledge and skills she passed on would enable these women to survive and even prosper within the system, but they would also ensure that the cycle of exploitation continued unbroken. The younger women looked at Phoebe with a mixture of admiration and fear, seeing in her both the possibility of success and the inevitability of decline. She represented what they might become if they were fortunate enough to attract elite clientele and intelligent enough to manage their careers skillfully. Yet she also embodied the ultimate fate that awaited all of them: the gradual loss of youth and beauty, the slow reduction in value, the eventual disposal when they were no longer profitable. One of the most promising of her students was a girl named Helena, barely 16 years old, who had been sold by her family to pay debts incurred during a poor harvest. Helena possessed the kind of natural beauty that required little enhancement, combined with an intelligence and adaptability that made her an ideal candidate for the elite market. Yet her very youth and innocence made the training process particularly difficult for Phoebe, who saw in Helena's fresh face and eager questions a reflection of her own lost innocence. The process of teaching Helena the skills she would need was like watching her own corruption played out in reverse. Each lesson in the arts of seduction, each technique for reading and manipulating male desire, each strategy for maintaining emotional distance while appearing intimate, represented another step in the systematic destruction of a young woman's authentic self. Phoebe found herself wondering whether her role as teacher made her complicit in Helena's exploitation, or whether her guidance might somehow reduce the girl's suffering. The relationship that developed between Phoebe and Helena was complex and emotionally fraught. Helena looked to her as a mentor and protector, seeking advice not just about professional matters, but about how to survive psychologically in an environment designed to break down individual identity. Phoebe found herself genuinely caring about the girl's welfare, a dangerous emotion in a world where personal attachments could be used as weapons by those in power. As Helena's training progressed and she began receiving her first clients, Phoebe watched with a mixture of pride and horror as the girl's natural personality slowly disappeared beneath layers of professional performance. The spontaneous laughter, the genuine curiosity about the world, the honest emotional reactions, all of these gradually gave way to the calculated responses and artificial behaviors that marked a successful courtesan. It was like watching someone die slowly, their authentic self suffocated beneath the requirements of their profession. The most successful of Phoebe's students was a young woman named Livia, who had been born into slavery, but possessed a combination of physical beauty and intellectual ability that marked her for elite service. Livia proved exceptionally adept at the psychological aspects of the work, developing an almost supernatural ability to read the desires and weaknesses of powerful men. She quickly attracted the attention of some of Rome's most influential citizens. generating profits that exceeded even what Phoebe had produced during her prime years. Yet, Livia's success came at a terrible cost. The psychological techniques that made her so effective with clients also seemed to erode her capacity for genuine human connection. She became increasingly cold and calculating, viewing every interaction through the lens of potential advantage or threat. Her relationship with Phoebe shifted from that of student and teacher to something resembling rivalry, as if she saw Phoebe's continued presence as an obstacle to her own advancement. The political climate of Rome during this period created additional pressures for everyone associated with Claudia's establishment. The emperor's attitude toward moral reform was creating scrutiny of activities that had previously been tolerated as long as they remained discreet. Several prominent politicians had fallen from grace due to scandals involving their private lives, creating an atmosphere of paranoia among the elite clientele who formed the establishment's primary market. These political pressures manifested in increased security measures and more elaborate precautions to maintain secrecy. Clients began arriving and departing through hidden entrances. Communications were conducted through coded messages, and even the most trusted servants were subjected to increased surveillance. The atmosphere of the establishment became increasingly tense as everyone involved understood that their activities were under greater scrutiny than ever before. It was during this period of heightened anxiety that Phoebe made a discovery that would ultimately seal her fate. While organizing old records for Claudia, she came across documents that revealed the true extent of the establishment's activities. Beyond simply providing sexual services to wealthy clients, Claudia had been systematically gathering information about her customers' political activities, business dealings, and personal secrets. This intelligence was then sold to various parties, foreign ambassadors, political rivals, business competitors, who were willing to pay substantial sums for inside information about Rome's elite. The realization that she had been not just a prostitute, but an unwitting spy filled Phoebe with a complex mixture of emotions. On one hand, there was a certain satisfaction in learning that the men who had used her had themselves been manipulated and exploited. Yet this knowledge also made her acutely aware of the danger she represented to powerful people who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. Claudia's reaction to Phoebe's discovery was swift and decisive. Rather than anger at the breach of security, she seemed almost relieved that someone finally understood the full scope of her operations. She explained to Phoebe that the information gathering had always been the most profitable aspect of the business, far more valuable than the sexual services that served primarily as a cover for intelligence operations. The beautiful women, the luxurious surroundings, the pretense of cultural sophistication, all of it was simply window dressing for what was essentially an elaborate espionage network. This revelation forced Phoebe to re-examine every aspect of her career, to understand that she had been not just a victim of sexual exploitation, but a tool in a larger game of political manipulation and control. The conversations she had conducted with clients, the secrets they had shared in moments of supposed intimacy, the information she had gathered through careful listening and observation, all of it had been carefully orchestrated to serve Claudia's intelligence-gathering operations. The knowledge of her true role in Claudia's enterprise made Phoebe incredibly dangerous to the powerful men who had unknowingly revealed their secrets to her. Several of her former clients now held positions of enormous influence within the imperial administration, their careers built on foundations that would crumble if certain information became public. Others had made business deals or political alliances that depended on secrets that Phoebe had helped to uncover. The solution to this problem, from the perspective of those with the power to implement it, was both obvious and final. Phoebe had become too dangerous to live, too knowledgeable to be allowed to exist in a world where her very presence represented a threat to some of Rome's most powerful citizens. The method chosen for her elimination was consistent with the subtle sophistication that had characterized every other aspect of her career. The poison that ended Phoebe's life was administered with the same careful attention to detail that had marked every other aspect of Claudia's operations. It was a substance that worked slowly, creating symptoms that might easily be attributed to natural illness. Over the course of several days, Phoebe experienced what appeared to be a gradual decline in health: fatigue, digestive problems, difficulty breathing, symptoms that seemed consistent with any number of common ailments that affected residents of Rome during the autumn months. Claudia maintained the pretense of concern throughout Phoebe's final illness, providing the best available medical care and expressing genuine seeming distress at her condition. Yet certain details revealed the true nature of the situation to those who knew how to read them. The particular physicians who were called, the treatments that were prescribed, the way that other residents of the establishment were kept away from Phoebe's room during her final days. The other women in the establishment understood what was happening without needing explicit confirmation. They had seen similar mysterious illnesses affect women who had become inconvenient or dangerous to Claudia's operations. The message was clear to anyone capable of reading it. Cooperation and discretion were not just expectations, but requirements for survival, and those who failed to meet these standards would be quietly eliminated. Helena, who had grown closest to Phoebe during her final months, was particularly affected by her mentor's death. The young woman had genuinely cared for Phoebe and had looked to her as a source of guidance and protection in an environment where such relationships were rare and precious. The loss of this connection, combined with the growing understanding of what had really happened, marked a turning point in Helena's own psychological development. The funeral arrangements for Phoebe were conducted with the same attention to appearance and respectability that had characterized her life. She was given a burial that befitted someone of apparent status and wealth, with mourners who had been paid to express grief and ceremonies that suggested she had been a respected member of society. Yet underneath this veneer of respectability, everyone involved understood the true nature of what had occurred. The official cause of death was recorded as a fever, a common enough ailment that raised no suspicions among those not privy to the true circumstances. The physician who signed the death certificate was one of several medical professionals who had financial relationships with Claudia's establishment, men who understood that their continued prosperity depended on their willingness to overlook certain inconsistencies in the cases they were asked to examine out in the days following Phoebe's death. Her personal possessions were distributed among the surviving residents of the establishment, a process that served both practical and psychological purposes. The practical aspect involved recycling valuable items, clothing, jewelry, cosmetics, that could be used by other women in their work. The psychological aspect was more subtle, but equally important, serving as a reminder that individual identity meant nothing in a world where people were viewed as interchangeable assets. Impact of Phoebe's death extended beyond the immediate circle of those who had known her personally. Word of her passing spread through the network of similar establishments throughout Rome, carried by the informal communication channels that connected those involved in the trade. Her story became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the ultimate fate that awaited those who learned too much or became too dangerous to the powerful men who formed the clientele for such services. Yet, perhaps the most tragic aspect of Phoebe's death was how quickly she was forgotten. Within weeks, her name was no longer mentioned in the establishment where she had lived and worked for nearly a decade. The room she had occupied was given to another woman, her clothing and personal effects absorbed into the general inventory. Her very existence erased, as if she had never lived at all. In a world where people were valued only for their utility, death represented not just the end of life, but the complete obliteration of individual significance. The silence that surrounded Phoebe's death was perhaps the most eloquent testimony to the nature of the world she had inhabited. No one spoke of what had really happened. No one questioned the official explanations. No one mourned the loss of a human being whose life had been systematically destroyed by the very system that had appeared to privilege her. Her death was absorbed into the ongoing operations of Claudia's establishment with the same efficiency that had characterized every other aspect of the business. Another problem solved, another potential threat eliminated, another reminder that in the end, everyone was expendable. Now let us turn our attention from the individual tragedies of those who lived and died in Rome's sexual economy to the archaeological evidence that has preserved their world in stunning and often disturbing detail. In the shadow of Mount Vesuvius, in the city of Pompeii, volcanic ash and pumice created a time capsule that captured not just buildings and artifacts, but the most intimate aspects of Roman life. When archaeologists began systematically excavating the city in the 18th and 19th centuries, they uncovered a world that challenged every assumption about ancient morality and revealed the extent to which sexual commerce permeated every level of Roman society. The famous lupanar of Pompeii, discovered in 1862, stands as perhaps the most complete and well-preserved brothel from the ancient world. Built on 2 levels with 5 small rooms on the ground floor and 5 more accessible by a narrow wooden staircase, the building represents the architectural embodiment of efficiency in the commodification of human sexuality. Each room measured barely 6 feet by 8 feet, containing only a stone bed covered with a thin mattress and a small window high on the wall that provided minimal light and ventilation. But it was not the architecture alone that shocked and fascinated the Victorian archaeologists who first explored these chambers. The walls of the lupanar were covered with explicit frescoes that depicted sexual acts in graphic detail, images so startling to 19th century sensibilities that many were immediately covered up or removed from public view. These paintings, executed with the same artistic skill that adorned the villas of the wealthy, served multiple purposes within the establishment: advertisement, instruction, and psychological conditioning for both clients and workers. The artistic technique employed in these frescoes reveals the casual attitude that Romans held towards sexual imagery. The paintings were not crude graffiti scratched into walls by frustrated customers, but carefully planned and professionally executed artworks that demonstrated the same attention to proportion, perspective, and color that characterized Roman art in general. The artists who created these images were skilled craftsmen who had clearly received formal training in the classical traditions of painting and decoration. The subject matter of the frescoes covered an extraordinary range of sexual activities, depicted with an explicitness that would be considered pornographic by most modern standards. Yet within the context of Roman culture, these images served practical rather than purely titillating purposes. They functioned as a visual menu of available services, allowing clients to communicate their desires without the need for potentially embarrassing verbal negotiations. For a society that included speakers of dozens of different languages and dialects, visual communication was often more efficient than verbal exchange. The artistic style of these paintings reveals important information about Roman attitudes towards sexuality and the human body. Unlike later Christian art, which would emphasize spiritual transcendence over physical reality, these frescoes celebrated the body in all its functions and desires. The figures are depicted with anatomical accuracy and without shame or embarrassment, reflecting a culture that viewed sexual activity as a natural and necessary part of human existence, rather than as something inherently sinful or degrading. Careful analysis of the pigments and techniques used in these paintings has revealed that they were created over an extended period, with some images being painted over or modified as the establishment's clientele and services evolved. This palimpsest effect provides valuable insight into the changing nature of the business and the ways in which sexual commerce adapted to meet shifting demands and preferences. Certain images show evidence of having been repeatedly touched or rubbed, suggesting that they served not just as visual aids, but as objects of veneration or desire in their own right. The positioning and composition of the frescoes demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of psychology and marketing. The most explicit images were placed in areas where they would be immediately visible to entering clients, serving to establish the establishment's purpose and create appropriate expectations. More subtle or suggestive imagery was used in transitional spaces, building anticipation while maintaining the visual flow between different areas of the building. Beyond the lupanar itself, explicit sexual imagery appears throughout Pompeii in contexts that reveal the pervasive nature of such content in Roman daily life. Private homes contained frescoes depicting sexual acts in bedrooms, gardens, and even public reception areas. Bakeries displayed phallic symbols as signs of fertility and good fortune. Taverns and thermopolia featured erotic imagery as decoration and advertisement. This widespread presence of sexual content suggests that Romans did not compartmentalize sexuality in the way that later cultures would, valuing it instead as an integral part of human experience worthy of artistic representation. The technical analysis of these paintings has revealed fascinating details about their creation and maintenance. The base layer of plaster was applied with the same care used in the finest domestic interiors, suggesting that the lupanar was considered a legitimate business deserving of quality construction and decoration. The paintings themselves were executed using the fresco secco technique, which allowed for greater detail and color saturation than true fresco, but required more frequent Maintenance and restoration. The discovery of painting tools and pigment. Residues in storage areas of the lupanar indicates that the establishment employed its own artists or maintained ongoing relationships with professional painters who regularly updated and maintained the decorative scheme. This investment in artistic quality suggests that visual appeal was considered crucial to the success of the business, and that clients expected a certain level of aesthetic sophistication even in establishments dedicated to purely physical transactions. Symbolic content of many frescoes extends beyond mere representation of sexual acts to include complex iconography that reflected Roman religious and cultural beliefs. Images of Priapus, the god of fertility and sexual potency, appear frequently, often in contexts that suggest both protection and blessing for the activities taking place within the building. Other mythological figures associated with sexuality and desire, Venus, Cupid, satyrs, and nymphs are incorporated into scenes that blend the sacred and profane in ways that would be unthinkable in later Christian contexts. The clothing and hairstyles depicted in the frescoes provide valuable information about the fashion and appearance standards of both sex workers and clients during the 1st century CE. Women are typically shown with elaborate coiffures that required significant time and skill to create, suggesting that even in establishments serving lower-class clientele, considerable attention was paid to personal grooming and presentation. The jewelry and accessories depicted in some images indicate that successful sex workers could afford luxury items that marked their status within their profession. The architectural context of the paintings reveals important information about the organization and operation of the establishment. Certain images appear to be positioned to provide guidance for specific activities or to establish rules and expectations for behavior within particular spaces. Others seem designed to create atmosphere or mood, using color and composition to transform cramped, windowless cells into spaces that could support fantasies of luxury or exotic adventure. Graffiti found throughout the lupanar provides a fascinating counterpoint to the official artistic program of the establishment. Written in Latin, Greek, and various local dialects, these inscriptions include price lists, appointment schedules, reviews of services, and personal messages between clients and workers. Some graffiti appears to be the work of the sex workers themselves, including complaints about working conditions, expressions of affection for particular clients, and coded communications with colleagues. The analysis of this graffiti has revealed information about literacy rates, languages spoken, and social interactions within the establishment. Surprisingly, many of the inscriptions demonstrate considerable education and cultural sophistication, suggesting that both clients and workers came from more diverse backgrounds than might be expected. Some graffiti includes quotations from classical literature, mathematical calculations, and even crude poetry, indicating that the lupanar served as a meeting place for people from various social and educational levels. The preservation of organic materials in some areas of the building has provided unprecedented insight into the daily operations of the establishment. Fabric fragments reveal information about clothing and bedding, while food remains indicate the types of meals that were served and the economic level of the clientele. Cosmetic containers and personal grooming tools found in storage areas show the efforts that were made to maintain appearance standards, while medical instruments suggest that basic health care was provided for workers when necessary. The explicit imagery found throughout Pompeii extends far beyond the obvious commercial purposes of the lupanar, revealing a complex system of visual communication that permeated Roman society at every level. Modern archaeologists and art historians have begun to decode these images not merely as pornographic decoration, but as sophisticated, symbolic languages that conveyed information about status, availability, preferences, and power relationships. In ways that transcended the barriers of spoken language and social class, the systematic study of erotic imagery throughout the city has revealed patterns that suggest a highly organized approach to visual communication about sexuality. Certain symbols appear repeatedly in specific contexts: phallic imagery at bakeries and workshops, suggestive poses on tavern walls, coded references to particular services in private homes. This consistency suggests that Romans had developed a shared visual vocabulary for sexual commerce that was as standardized and widely understood as their monetary system or legal codes. The technical analysis of pigments used in these frescoes has revealed information about trade networks and economic relationships that connected local establishments to suppliers throughout the Mediterranean world. The expensive ultramarine blue found in some paintings came from mines in Afghanistan, while certain red pigments were derived from cinnabar, mined in Spain. The presence of these costly materials in a commercial brothel suggests that visual presentation was considered crucial enough to justify significant investment in materials and craftsmanship. Archaeological investigation of the workshop areas adjacent to the lupanar has uncovered evidence of a sophisticated support system that maintained the establishment's operations. Rooms containing large amounts of broken ceramic vessels suggest that food and drink were prepared on site, while storage areas filled with olive oil containers indicate the scale of operations and the variety of substances used in the provision of services. The discovery of medical instruments and pharmaceutical preparations reveals attempts to maintain the health of workers in an environment where disease was a constant threat. The analysis of building modifications over time shows how the establishment adapted to changing market conditions and regulatory requirements. Structural alterations reveal periods of expansion and contraction, while changes in decorative schemes suggest shifts in clientele and services offered. Some rooms show evidence of having been subdivided to create smaller, more private spaces, while others were enlarged to accommodate group activities or special events. The study of light and ventilation systems within the building reveals sophisticated engineering designed to balance practical needs with atmospheric effects. Oil lamp placement was carefully calculated to provide adequate illumination for business purposes, while creating shadows and highlights that enhanced the visual impact of the frescoes. Ventilation shafts were positioned to remove unpleasant odors while maintaining the warm, enclosed feeling that encouraged intimacy and privacy. Recent excavations have uncovered evidence of security measures that protected both the establishment and its occupants. Hidden passages connected different parts of the building, allowing for discreet movement and emergency evacuation if necessary. Reinforced doors and window bars suggest that protection from violence was a constant concern, while secret storage areas contained valuables and important documents that needed to be kept safe from theft or official scrutiny. The investigation of waste disposal systems has provided valuable insight into the daily operations and hygiene practices of the establishment. Sophisticated plumbing systems carried away human waste and dirty water, while specialized disposal areas contained the remains of food, broken objects, and other detritus that accumulated during normal operations. The analysis of this waste material has revealed information about diet, health, and living conditions that complements the evidence provided by architecture and art. Chemical analysis of residues found throughout the building has identified a wide variety of substances used in the provision of services. Oils and ointments derived from plants throughout the empire were used for massage and lubrication, while exotic perfumes and cosmetics helped create the sensory experiences the clients expected. The presence of various contraceptive and abortifacient substances reveals attempts to manage the reproductive consequences of the work. Though the effectiveness of these ancient methods was limited, the discovery of personal items belonging to the establishment's workers provides a poignant glimpse into their individual lives and experiences. Jewelry, cosmetics, and personal grooming tools reveal efforts to maintain dignity and self-respect in circumstances that systematically stripped away both. Letters and personal documents, when they survive, offer rare first-hand accounts of the thoughts and feelings of people whose voices are otherwise lost to history. The broader archaeological context reveals how establishments like the lupanar were integrated into the commercial and social fabric of Roman cities. Trade relationships connected these businesses to suppliers of food, clothing, cosmetics, and other necessities, while financial records show their participation in the banking and credit systems that supported urban commerce. The location of brothels within commercial districts, rather than isolated red light areas, suggests that sexual commerce was viewed as a legitimate part of the urban economy. Comparative analysis of similar sites throughout the Roman Empire reveals both standardization and local variation in the organization of sexual commerce. While basic architectural patterns and decorative schemes were consistent across the empire, local influences affected everything from artistic styles to operational procedures. These variations provide insight into how Roman sexual culture adapted to different regional traditions and legal frameworks. The most fascinating aspect of Pompeii's preserved erotic imagery lies not in its explicit content, but in the sophisticated coding systems that allowed Romans to communicate complex information about sexual services, preferences, and social relationships through seemingly simple visual elements. Modern scholars have begun to recognize that what Victorian archaeologists dismissed as crude pornography was actually a highly developed, symbolic language that conveyed meaning across barriers of class, education, and spoken language. The positioning and context of erotic imagery throughout the city reveals a carefully planned system of visual communication that extended far beyond the obvious advertising functions. In private homes, the placement of sexual imagery in specific rooms conveyed information about the household's attitudes toward sexuality, the availability of certain services, and the social status of both residents and visitors. Bedrooms might feature scenes of marital intimacy, while reception areas displayed images that indicated the host's sophistication and openness to various forms of entertainment. The analysis of color symbolism in these frescoes has revealed additional layers of meaning that would have been immediately apparent to ancient viewers, but are easily missed by modern observers. Red, the color of blood and passion, was used to indicate intensity and availability, while purple, associated with wealth and status, marked premium services or elite clientele. The use of gold leaf in certain images signified the highest levels of luxury and exclusivity, while earth tones suggested more accessible or democratic options. The study of gesture and pose in erotic art has uncovered a complex vocabulary, physical communication that transcended cultural and linguistic boundaries. Specific hand positions, facial expressions, and body arrangements conveyed detailed information about services offered, prices charged, and the social status of participants. These gestural codes were so standardized that a visitor from any part of the empire could navigate the sexual marketplace of an unfamiliar city simply by reading the visual cues embedded in public and private art. Archaeological investigation of workshops that produced erotic art has revealed the professional networks that created and maintained these visual communication systems. Specialized artists traveled between cities, carrying standardized iconographic programs that ensured consistency in symbolic meaning across vast distances. Training schools for artists included instruction in the proper execution of erotic imagery, treating it as seriously as any other aspect of professional decoration and design. The discovery of portable erotic objects, lamps, jewelry, household items decorated with sexual imagery reveals how these visual languages extended into the most intimate aspects of daily life. Small bronze mirrors featured scenes that conveyed information about their owner's sexual preferences, while ceramic vessels displayed images that indicated their intended use in various intimate rituals. These objects served as personal advertisements, allowing individuals to communicate their interests and availability without the need for verbal declarations. The analysis of architectural modifications in buildings throughout Pompeii has revealed how spaces were adapted to support different types of sexual commerce. Rooms that appear to have been ordinary domestic spaces show evidence of structural changes that created more private environments, improved acoustics for musical entertainment, or provided better lighting for artistic performances. These modifications suggest that sexual services were offered in a wide variety of settings beyond the dedicated brothels that have received most scholarly attention. The study of water systems and bathing facilities throughout the city reveals the importance of cleanliness and purification rituals in Roman sexual culture. Elaborate bath complexes associated with entertainment districts provided not just hygiene services, but sophisticated environments for social interaction and negotiation. The positioning of these facilities in relation to other commercial establishments suggests that bathing was considered an integral part of the sexual commerce experience rather than merely a practical necessity. Investigation of food and dining facilities in entertainment districts has uncovered evidence of elaborate hospitality customs that surrounded sexual commerce. Specialized kitchens prepared exotic foods and aphrodisiac preparations, while dining rooms were designed to create intimate atmospheres that enhanced the overall experience of purchased intimacy. The discovery of imported spices, rare wines, and luxury ingredients suggests that culinary sophistication was considered as important as physical beauty in attracting and satisfying wealthy clients. The analysis of musical instruments and performance spaces reveals the integration of artistic Entertainment with sexual services. Specialized rooms with acoustic properties suitable for musical performance, dancing, or theatrical presentations suggest that many establishments offered comprehensive entertainment packages rather than simple sexual transactions. The quality of instruments discovered indicates significant investment in artistic excellence, suggesting that cultural sophistication was a key marketing tool in the competition for elite clientele. The study of textile remains and clothing accessories has revealed information about the costume and presentation systems used by sex workers to communicate their specialties and status. Different fabric weights, colors, and decorative elements conveyed specific information about services offered, prices charged, and the social level of clientele served. The discovery of foreign textiles and exotic clothing styles suggests that cultural role-playing and fantasy fulfillment were important aspects of the Roman sexual marketplace. Archaeological investigation of storage and security systems throughout entertainment districts reveals the valuable nature of the goods and information that these establishments accumulated. Hidden compartments contained not just money and valuable objects, but also documents that recorded client preferences, political information, and business relationships that extended far beyond simple commercial transactions. The sophistication of these security measures indicates that sexual commerce establishments served as repositories of sensitive information that could be valuable to various political and commercial interests. The discovery of educational materials and training devices reveals the systematic approach taken to preparing individuals for work in the sexual marketplace. Instructional art, practice implements, and reference materials suggest that comprehensive training programs existed to ensure that workers could meet the sophisticated demands of educated and wealthy clients. The quality of these educational resources indicates that professional development was considered important for maintaining competitive advantage in a crowded marketplace. Investigation of medical and pharmaceutical facilities associated with entertainment districts has revealed sophisticated approaches to health maintenance and contraception. Specialized medical practitioners provided services ranging from cosmetic enhancement to disease treatment, while pharmaceutical preparations included both practical medicines and substances designed to enhance performance or pleasure. The presence of surgical instruments and advanced medical texts suggests that these establishments maintained medical standards that exceeded those available to much of the general population. Now we turn from the preserved evidence of Pompeii to the living rooms and private chambers of Rome's elite, where sexual commerce took on entirely different forms but served remarkably similar functions. In the marble halls and perfumed gardens of patrician villas, power and pleasure intertwined in ways that were both more subtle and more absolute than anything found in the commercial establishments of the city's entertainment districts. Here, among the most powerful families of the empire, sexuality became a tool of politics, a marker of status, and a weapon of control that shaped the destinies of nations. The evening entertainment hosted by Rome's elite families followed patterns that had been refined over generations of political maneuvering and social competition. These gatherings, known as cene or convivium, were carefully orchestrated events, where every detail, from the selection of guests to the arrangement of seating, from the choice of entertainment to the timing of each course, served multiple purposes in the complex game of imperial politics. What appeared to casual observers as simple dinner parties were actually sophisticated exercises in power projection, alliance building, and information gathering that determined the fate of provinces and the careers of ambitious men. The physical setting for these gatherings reflected not just wealth, but a sophisticated understanding of psychology and social control. Private dining rooms in elite villas were designed to create atmosphere and facilitate specific types of interaction. Rooms with different acoustics were chosen based on whether the evening's conversation required discretion or projection, while lighting schemes using hundreds of oil lamps created moods that ranged from intimate to theatrical. The positioning of couches, tables, and serving areas followed protocols that had been developed over centuries to maximize both comfort and the host's ability to observe and direct the evening's activities. The guest lists for these events were constructed with the same strategic precision that generals used in planning military campaigns. Each invitation represented a calculated decision about political alliances, business relationships, and social obligations that extended far beyond simple hospitality. senators whose votes might be needed for upcoming legislation, wealthy merchants whose financial support could fund political careers, foreign ambassadors whose governments required cultivation, and intellectuals whose ideas could influence public opinion. All were carefully balanced to create the optimal mixture of personalities and interests for the fin. Evening's objectives. The entertainment provided at these gatherings extended far beyond the simple pleasure of fine food and wine, encompassing elaborate performances that demonstrated the host's wealth, sophistication, and connections throughout the empire. Professional musicians trained in the conservatories of Greece and Alexandria performed compositions that had been commissioned specifically for the occasion, while dancers from Egypt, Spain, and other exotic locations presented choreography that combined artistic excellence with subtle eroticism designed to stimulate conversation and create memorable experiences. Yet it was in the provision of more intimate entertainment that the true nature of elite Roman sexuality revealed itself. The women who attended these gatherings as companions, entertainers, and providers of sexual services represented the pinnacle of refinement and training in their profession. Unlike the workers in commercial establishments who served multiple clients with minimal interaction, these elite courtesans were expected to become temporary mistresses, intellectual companions, and confidential advisors to some of the most powerful men in the world. The selection and training of women for these roles required resources and expertise that only the wealthiest families could afford. Candidates were chosen not just for their physical beauty, but for their intelligence, education, and psychological resilience. Training programs that lasted for years included instruction in literature, philosophy, music, and rhetoric, as well as the more intimate skills required for their ultimate profession. Language instruction enabled them to converse fluently with guests from throughout the empire, while cultural education allowed them to adapt their behavior to the preferences and expectations of men from different backgrounds. The contrast between the crude commercial transactions of the fair, street-level lupaners, and the refined sensuality of elite gatherings reveals the profound class divisions that shaped every aspect of Roman sexuality. While common sex workers endured mechanistic encounters in windowless cells, the courtesans who served the empire's most powerful citizens experienced sexuality as an elaborate performance art that combined physical pleasure with intellectual stimulation, political intrigue, and cultural sophistication. Yet beneath these surface differences lay the same fundamental reality, the systematic commodification of human intimacy in service of power and profit. The educational systems that prepared women for elite sexual service represented some of the most sophisticated training programs in the ancient world. Private academies established by wealthy entrepreneurs recruited candidates from throughout the empire, selecting young women whose combination of beauty, intelligence, and psychological resilience marked them as potentially valuable assets in the luxury market for human companionship. These institutions provided education that rivaled the finest schools available to the sons of senators, including instruction in multiple languages, classical literature, philosophy, mathematics, music, and rhetoric. The cultural curriculum for these elite trainees extended far beyond academic subjects to include sophisticated training in the arts of social interaction and psychological manipulation. Students learned to read facial expressions, interpret tone of voice, and respond to subtle social cues that might indicate a client's mood, preferences, or intentions. They studied the personal histories, political positions, and family relationships of prominent Romans so that they could engage in informed conversation about topics that interested their future clients. They practiced the art of appearing genuinely interested in subjects that might bore them while maintaining the intellectual agility to shift topics smoothly when conversations turned in unexpected directions. The physical training provided to these elite courtesans was equally comprehensive and sophisticated. In addition to instruction in various sexual techniques, students learned dancing, massage, and other physical arts that could enhance the pleasure and relaxation of their clients. They studied the use of cosmetics, perfumes, and clothing to create specific visual and sensory effects, while also learning to adapt their appearance to suit different occasions and client preferences. Voice training helped them develop speaking and singing abilities that could be used for entertainment as well as intimate conversation. The psychological preparation for elite sexual service required perhaps the most sophisticated instruction of all. Students learn techniques for maintaining emotional distance while appearing intimate, for creating the illusion of genuine affection while protecting their own psychological well-being, and for managing the complex power dynamics that characterized relationships with wealthy and influential men. They studied methods for gathering information without appearing curious, for remembering important details without seeming calculating, and for providing emotional support without becoming emotionally invested in their clients' problems. Economic arrangements that governed elite sexual commerce created a complex web of relationships that extended far beyond simple service provision. Many courtesans became informal business partners with their clients, receiving not just payment for services, but also investment opportunities, property rights, and other financial arrangements that could provide long-term security. Some established independent enterprises using capital provided by wealthy patrons, while others became silent partners in commercial ventures that generated ongoing income. The most successful developed diverse investment portfolios that made them financially independent and allowed them to choose their clients based on personal preference rather than economic necessity. The ultimate irony of Roman sexual commerce lay not in its cruelty or exploitation, which were apparent to anyone who cared to observe, but in the way it simultaneously corrupted both the purchasers and the purchased, creating a system where human dignity was systematically destroyed on both sides of every transaction. The wealthy men who bought intimate access to carefully trained women were themselves trapped in a culture that measured masculine worth through the ability to dominate others, while the women who provided these services were forced to surrender their authentic selves in exchange for survival and the illusion of privilege. The psychological damage inflicted by this system extended far beyond the immediate participants to affect families, political institutions, and the broader social fabric of the empire. Senators who spent their evenings in elaborate sexual performances with purchased companions returned home to wives who were expected to embody virtue and restraint, creating households built on fundamental deceptions about the nature of their marriages and the character of their husbands. Children grew up in environments where their fathers' public personas bore no resemblance to their private behaviors, learning that hypocrisy was not just acceptable, but necessary for maintaining social status and political power. The wives of elite Roman men existed in a particularly complex and painful position within this system, legally and socially required to maintain reputations for chastity and domestic virtue. They were simultaneously expected to tolerate and even facilitate their husbands' relationships with courtesans and sex workers. Some developed their own networks of female companions and lovers, creating parallel systems of emotional and physical intimacy that operated within the constraints of their prescribed social roles. Others channeled their intelligence and ambition into political activities, using their husbands' careers as vehicles for their own pursuit of influence and power. The children of elite families learned from early ages to navigate the complex moral landscape created by their parents' participation in sexual commerce. Sons were often introduced to the system as part of their education in masculine behavior, learning to view the purchase of sexual services as a normal part of adult male life. Daughters were trained to ignore evidence of their fathers and brothers' activities while simultaneously preparing for marriages that would likely involve similar patterns of infidelity and deception. The psychological impact of these early experiences shaped their understanding of relationships, power, and human worth in ways that perpetuated the system across generations. The political consequences of widespread elite participation in sexual commerce were far-reaching and destabilizing. The networks of courtesans and sex workers who served powerful men created alternative channels of information and influence that operated outside official governmental structures. Decisions about military campaigns, provincial appointments, and commercial policies were influenced by conversations that took place in brothels and private dining rooms, while intelligence gathered through intimate relationships was used to advance personal interests rather than the common good of the empire. As we emerge from this long journey through the shadows of ancient Rome, take a moment to feel the comfort of your own bed, the safety of your own room, the simple dignity of being able to choose how you spend your time and with whom you share your intimacy. The distance between our world and theirs is measured not just in years, but in fundamental assumptions about human worth, individual autonomy, and the rights that we now consider inalienable, but which were entirely absent from the experiences we have explored tonight. The stories we have followed, From the nameless women trapped in windowless cells to Phoebe's gilded captivity, from the preserved frescoes of Pompeii to the elaborate dinner parties of the elite, all illuminate a single devastating truth about the nature of systematic exploitation. The Roman system of sexual commerce was not an aberration or a failure of their civilization, but rather one of its most successful and enduring institutions, operating with the same efficiency and sophistication that characterized their military, their administration, and their engineering projects. What makes this history particularly disturbing is not its cruelty, which was obvious and immediate, but its sustainability and acceptance within a society that prided itself on law, order, and civilized behavior. The Romans did not hide their sexual commerce or treat it as a shameful secret that needed to be concealed from public view. Instead, they integrated it so thoroughly into their social and economic systems that it became invisible, not because it was hidden, but because it was so normalized that most people stopped seeing it as remarkable or problematic. The women whose lives we have examined were not faceless victims, but individuals with their own stories, dreams, and struggles for dignity within. Circumstances that systematically denied their humanity. Their experiences remind us that behind every system of exploitation are real people who suffer real consequences, who develop real strategies for survival, and who maintain real hope for something better, even in the darkest circumstances. Their voices may have been silenced by death and time, but their experiences continue to speak to us across the centuries about the resilience of human spirit and the terrible cost of treating people as commodities. The men who participated in this system as purchasers, managers, and beneficiaries were themselves damaged by their participation in structures that corrupted their capacity for genuine human connection. The senators and merchants who sought intimacy through financial transaction, the businessmen who profited from human misery, and the ordinary citizens who accepted exploitation as normal, all were diminished by their complicity in systems that reduced the most fundamental human experiences to mere commercial exchanges. Perhaps most importantly, the Roman experience demonstrates how quickly and completely entire societies can adapt to treating systematic dehumanization as normal and acceptable. The elaborate legal, cultural, and intellectual frameworks that Romans developed to justify sexual commerce show how human ingenuity can be directed toward rationalizing even the most fundamentally immoral practices. The same creativity and intelligence that produced their greatest achievements were also applied to perfecting methods of human exploitation and developing theories that made such exploitation seem natural and inevitable. The archaeological evidence from Pompeii and other sites provides us with physical proof of how these systems operated, preserving in ash and stone the material culture of exploitation that might otherwise have been forgotten or denied. These preserved remains force us to confront the reality that beautiful art, sophisticated architecture, and refined culture can coexist with systematic brutality. The frescoes that decorated brothel walls were created by skilled artists. The buildings that housed sexual commerce were engineered with the same expertise used for temples and theaters. And the social rituals that surrounded elite sexual services were as elaborate and meaningful as any other aspect of Roman ceremonial life. Yet the archaeological record also preserves evidence of human resistance and dignity that survived even in the most degrading circumstances. The graffiti left by sex workers, the personal objects they managed to keep, and the small acts of mutual support and solidarity that archaeologists have uncovered all testify to the fact that human spirit cannot be entirely crushed by external circumstances. Even in the worst conditions, people found ways to maintain their humanity, to care for each other, and to preserve some sense of individual identity and worth. The contrast between the experiences of common sex workers and elite courtesans illustrates how systems of exploitation often create hierarchies of privilege that divide potential allies and make unified resistance more difficult. The women who served wealthy clients in luxurious surroundings were encouraged to see themselves as different from and superior to those who worked in street-level brothels, while both groups were kept separate from the respectable women whose virtue depended partly on the availability of outlets for male desires that could not be satisfied within marriage. These divisions prevented the formation of alliances that might have challenged the system itself. The international dimensions of Roman sexual commerce remind us that exploitation is rarely confined to local or national boundaries, but instead creates networks of trafficking and abuse that span continents. The demand for exotic women to serve Roman elites created markets for human trafficking throughout the known world, while the techniques and systems developed in Rome were exported to other parts of the empire and beyond. The globalization of exploitation that we recognize in our modern world has ancient precedents that operated with similar efficiency and similar disregard for human cost. The religious and spiritual dimensions of Roman sexual culture reveal how even the most sacred aspects of human experience can be corrupted by systems that reduce people to commodities. The integration of sexual imagery into religious art and the incorporation of spiritual practices into commercial sexual services show how exploitation can penetrate every aspect of human culture, transforming even those institutions that should serve as refuges for human dignity into mechanisms for further degradation. The political consequences of systematic sexual commerce demonstrate how the corruption of personal relationships inevitably affects public institutions and governmental processes. When the most powerful members of society regularly participate in the purchase and exploitation of vulnerable people, they lose the moral authority necessary for effective governance and become susceptible to various forms of blackmail and manipulation. The networks of information and influence that developed around sexual commerce created alternative power structures that operated outside democratic accountability and legal oversight. The long-term historical impact of Roman sexual commerce extends far beyond the classical period to influence subsequent civilizations and legal systems. The precedents established by Roman law regarding slavery, prostitution, and the rights of women continued to shape legal thinking for centuries, while the cultural attitudes developed during this period influenced art, literature, and social customs throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. Understanding this history helps us recognize how contemporary forms of exploitation have deep historical roots and how cultural patterns of dehumanization can persist across centuries. The silence that surrounded the most brutal aspects of Roman sexual commerce provides a sobering lesson about how societies can collectively choose not to see systematic suffering that occurs in their midst. The same mechanisms that allowed Romans to ignore or rationalize the exploitation happening around them continue to operate in our modern world, enabling contemporary forms of trafficking, exploitation, and abuse to persist despite widespread awareness of their existence. As you settle into sleep tonight, surrounded by the safety and freedom that we often take for granted, remember that the story of Rome's sexual commerce is not just ancient history but a warning about the human capacity for both cruelty and indifference. The distance between civilization and barbarism is often much smaller than we want to believe, and the institutions that protect human dignity require constant vigilance and active defense against those who would sacrifice individual worth for personal gain or social convenience. The women whose stories we have followed tonight, the anonymous workers in cramped cells, Phoebe in her gilded captivity, and all the others whose names and experiences have been lost to time, deserve to be remembered not just as victims, but as human beings who maintained their dignity and humanity under impossible circumstances. Their suffering was not meaningless. If it helps us recognize and resist similar patterns of exploitation in our own time, their voices, preserved in fragmentary evidence and archaeological remains, continue to speak across the centuries about the fundamental worth of every human being and the terrible cost of forgetting that truth. Sleep well tonight, knowing that you live in a world where, despite its many flaws and ongoing struggles, the basic dignity of human beings is more widely recognized and legally protected than ever before in history. Yet sleep also with the awareness that this progress is not inevitable or permanent, and that each generation must choose anew whether to honor the humanity of all people or to repeat the mistakes of those who came before. The price of human dignity, as always, is eternal vigilance and the memory of those who paid that price with their lives and their suffering in the brothels of ancient Rome.